there's always some emergency or something going on. So, quick recap of where we were up to in the last section. Signal seems to be working here, which is really, really good news because it has been very, very weak recently. So emotional incest, as opposed to regular incest as we would normally understand it, is not necessarily, it's to distinguish it from regular incest, which would be inappropriate sexual relationships amongst family members. In the case of emotional incest, usually that would be a parent to a child. A parent would be doing it to a child, where the child obviously cannot consent and doesn't consent. What are the effects of that? The effects of that are delivered to the child's boundaries. So if somebody is regularly breaking down your boundaries and forcing their needs upon you, especially if they're in an authority position, if they're in a position of power over you, they are both breaking down the wall of your boundaries and then pushing what they want into your personal space. And that is true even if you are simply forced into a certain role. So let's do this step by step. If you imagine a human being, like a small human being, known by normal people as a child. I don't know why I said small human being. A young human. A young entity of the human species. A child, Richard. They're called children, right? A young human being. And you imagine them as a small vessel. And they're a vessel that is seeking to grow. And they're very, very fragile when they're small. We are very, very fragile when we're small, when we're young. The vessel walls, they're like the walls of an egg, but they're not hard yet. They're still soft. Indeed, the egg of the human head is still soft around the crown when a human is born, and remains soft for a while. And then eventually it knits together and it hardens, as it should. And in that hardening, in that toughening, it becomes protected. So our walls, our boundaries protect us. They protect us from external influences. They protect us from other people. If those walls are consistently broken down and that vessel is then damaged, that is a problem, because when the vessel moves around through life, it will let out that which is good, which it should have kept, and it will let in that which is bad, which it should not have let in. So there's a crack, there's a tearing, there's a fracturing in the vessel. And those fractures, those cracks, will usually last a lifetime. But it doesn't end there, because it's not just that the boundaries were broken, it's that something was put into that vessel that was not of the vessel's choosing and is not for the vessel's benefit. It's kind of like, poisoning the chalice. The chalice from the palace is the brew that is true, and the vessel with the pestle holds the poison, as you all know. It's a very important wisdom. So the child who's raised in an emotionally incestuous environment will never really know where they end and the other person begins. One of the functions of the ego, a healthy ego, is that it is able to let you know where you end and other people begin, where other people end and where you begin. That shell, that egg, that wall, that vessel wall needs to be in place. The ego's function is kind of to guard or govern that which comes through the castle gate. It's one of the ego's functions. Would be to guard what comes in and what goes out and how it's processed and what things mean. So to that extent, it's worth reminding ourselves that we are selective about the data that we draw in from the environment. We draw it in as a vessel. Your cranium, your skull, is like an egg. It's a vessel, and it has doors on it. Doors, gates. Your gob hole is a gate. Your nose holes, your eye holes, and your ear holes. Your gob your mouth and your eyes are the only things that you can voluntarily, physically close in order to stop letting things in. But this is the main part of your body as a vessel where things come in, where information comes in. That's the only thing that's coming in, apart from calories, is information. And even in the calories, there's information, there's data. So a child raised in an emotionally incestuous environment won't know where they end and where others begin in their adult relationships. They will struggle to maintain boundaries with other people. They'll struggle to say no. They'll struggle to assert themselves because they won't have a self to assert. They won't know what they want. They won't be able to make decisions. They won't be able to move forward. They won't really know what's best for them. They wouldn't even be able to make that judgment. And in many ways, it would simply be easier to replicate what it is they experienced in their childhood, which is having their boundaries broken and letting somebody else fill them up with something that is poisonous. That could be a poisonous ideology, could be a poisonous doctrine. It's not all about interpersonal relationships and romance, of course. It could be politics, it could be religion, it could be philosophy, it could be psychology, it could be a cult. All of these things can be made to function as, how should I put it, narcissistically abusive tools. There's many ways of doing narcissistic abuse, many media that offer us the ability to narcissistically and emotionally abuse another person. But it's highly likely that throughout life, the child of emotional incest will feel most comfortable and most at home in a relationship where their boundaries are regularly being smashed down and where they're regularly being forced to imbibe poison. Okay, so at the microcosmic and romantic level, the poison could be, a man who abuses his girlfriend emotionally and occasionally physically. He tells her she's worthless, unlovable, that she's fat, that she's ugly. This is an example of putting poison into a vessel. A woman who gets with a man and tells him he's not a real man, he's useless, he lacks potency, I don't know, he's low down the the power hierarchy monkey tree or something, whatever it is, to put that poison into him and to infringe upon his boundaries. Another element of this that is a little bit worrying is, in order for a child to really have experienced emotional incest, in a certain sense, the parent rests their boot upon the child's neck. So I know I'm using a lot of pretty graphic imagery here today, but I really want to convey something that's not so easy to convey. So when I say, it's probably easy to understand, okay, the power dynamic in childhood was infringe my boundaries and put poison into me, abuse me as a vessel. Okay, got it. But that makes it sound like the vessel is sometimes left alone and then it is broken again and then new poison is put into it. But actually what I think more typically plays out is the boot just rests permanently on the neck. So the vessel is never not infiltrated. The vessel is in a truly emotionally abusive relationship, when it's true narcissistic abuse, the vessel is never left alone. They're never left to recover. So they're never not infiltrated. The enemy is always there, it's ever present, and that becomes part of the relationship dynamic. It's just a boot constantly resting on your neck. What would that look like for a child, a small human who grows into a big human, when the child becomes an adult? Well, they will look for boundary breaking relationships where poison is put into them, and they'll look for relationships where somebody is constantly resting a boot upon their neck. So that's emotional incest. And those are the effects of emotional incest, of having your boundaries broken. A lot of people who identify as being codependent, as having CPTSD, so on and so forth, the core issue that they have in this codependency that we have within this thing that we call codependency, the fawn response, people pleaser syndrome, is really, really weak boundaries. Sometimes it's useful to phrase it that way, because when we phrase the problem that way, the solution, we can't talk about the problem without implying what the solution is. So if I say you're a codependent, I'd be like, so the solution would be a cooperative dependent, a code dependent, like what's the solution there? Or if I say you're a fawn responder, you'd be like, I'm a fawn. Okay, so do I need to become a centaur in order to overcome? There's no solution implicit. But if I say to you, your problem is weak boundaries, you might be offended by that at first, but the solution's right there. If I say to you, your problem is weak glutes, or your problem is a weak hamstrings, what's the solution? Strength. Strengthen the glutes, strengthen the hamstrings, strengthen the delts, whatever your personal trainer says, you're weak here. Then we can identify what it is that we need to do. So if we say this is an issue of weak boundaries, but as I said in the first video that I unfortunately had to cut off due to a terrible emergency of great import that involved towels and the delivery of them, if I say your problem is you have weak boundaries, because I've coded the language in such a simplified way, you might unpack that as, oh, I need to just stand up for myself and ask for what I want. No. Weak boundaries is far more complicated than that. The effects are far wider ranging, and it'll pop up in your life in really strange ways. I would claim, and I'm not alone in this, weak boundaries at the psychological and emotional level are responsible for a ton of disease, physical illness. Many physical illnesses are there as either a direct result of weak or broken boundaries, or you can very easily, within 2 steps, trace back the weak boundaries. When people are dying of stress because they're addicted to work, and they can't say no to taking on more work, and they can't say no to making more money, weak boundaries. So how many steps was that? Weak boundaries, can't say no to work, addicted to more and more success and more and more money, stress, death. I mean, it really is, I think it really is as simple as that. I've shied away up until this point. I've always believed that since this channel started in 2013. But I've shied away from saying things like that because it sounds a little dangerously woo. It sounds a little bit new age. And now I just think, well, I do think that, so I may as well just say it. And if people want to write me off as being a hippie, then fine, fuck it. It's just let that happen. Okay, guys. So if you've got any questions about weak boundaries and emotional incest, now would be a good time to send them over. Please make your questions 1 sentence long and end in a question mark, and I'll try and get through as many as I possibly can. Jeff Watkins asks, a hippie Englishman, is there such a thing? Oh yes, there are many hippie English men. You may have heard of John Lennon. Richard, is it weird for your parents to tuck you in your 20s? I would think past the age of 8 or 9, that would be, I don't know, certainly past 11. You'd probably want to not be doing that. So yes, in the 20s, yes, I would consider that weird. Joan says, what are key symptoms in an adult who was victim of emotional incest as a child? Very weak boundaries, very, very poor boundaries, a very damaged sense of self. And it would look very, very close to many of the symptoms of CPTSD. The beginner gardener says, are you back on the whirl? I am not at the moment. Nat asks, does a parent pushing the role of caregiver to siblings count as emotional incest? Yes, that's emotional incest. Your siblings are children as well, so they shouldn't be caretakers. They shouldn't be acting as parents. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have responsibilities, but if the level of responsibility is too high, inappropriately high, yes, that would be considered a kind of emotional incest. Good Mother asks, do you think we could make huge societal change if we just have a worldwide movie night and watch 300? 300 is worth watching again. It did not age well. It's not a great film, unfortunately. It's good fun, but it's not great. Okay. If you can make the questions like a sentence long and end in a question mark, would be easier. I didn't bring my glasses outside. I'm not going to go and get them now. Carrie asks, if the parent openly complains about their relationship in front of the child, is it emotional incest? Yes, to a degree. It's certainly completely inappropriate and boundary breaking. If they then wanted to treat their child like a drinking buddy at a bar and get into the really granular details of the way in which their wife or their husband disappointed them, that would be emotional incest. If they're just complaining about their partner, it's just inappropriate and boundary breaking. Very selfish. I mean, it's not good for a child to be subjected to that kind of crap. Jeff says 300. It's the story of willfulness suggesting value. It's a great story. The Battle of Thermopylae is a great story. The graphic novel that it was based on by Frank Miller is really, really good and worth a read. I think Stephen Pressfield did a great job with Gates of Fire. If you want to read historical fiction that's fun and exciting. About the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the 300, that's what the story is about, is the Battle of Thermopylae at the Gates of Fire. Yeah, but that movie with Gerard Butler, it's not good, it's not a good film. Okay. Tips for weak boundaries. You must develop stronger boundaries. Yeah, I do have tips for them. To develop stronger boundaries, a good place to start is to seek to overcome your emotional flashbacks. You must be actively dealing with any and all emotional flashbacks because, well, I've gone into in detail. Let me say this as quickly as I can. Imagine it's a sci-fi movie. It's Star Wars. Or no, Star Trek would be more for this. And you have a ship that's flying through space, and it has a force field around it that's protective, and it's like armor. When the ship goes into a certain state of emergency, a certain alarm is sounding on the ship, that force field, the blaster shield that protects the ship, switches off. That would be like what happens with many people who go into emotional flashbacks and their boundaries, which is why the narcissistic, the abusive relationship it fits hand in glove, and the narcissist's role in the codependent's life is a continuation of childhood abuse in many cases. And not only does the narcissist continue the abuse, they worsen the abuse because they set you off into more emotional flashbacks. So say if you'd had emotional flashbacks, you had CPTSD, you had emotional flashbacks and you were getting better, they would undo all of that. They would undo all of your healing. They would set you back years, and they would cause you to go into a series of very strong cascading flashbacks and where you would have no boundaries. You must also develop your emotional literacy so that you don't go into emotional flashbacks, so that you do know where your boundaries are. It's very hard to know where your boundaries are if you're flashbacking. Very, very hard, especially if you're flashbacking as a fawn responder. as a people pleaser responder, as a codependent responder, because you want to please other people, and setting boundaries with other people won't please them, and you must please them, so it becomes very difficult. I have a new course out called Summoning the Self that focuses exclusively on overcoming codependency, and particularly on strengthening weak boundaries in exactly the way we're talking about here. So if you're really interested, the Summoning the Self course is something I would recommend trying. Janet says it's a good course. Thank you, Janet. Lucy asks, hi Richard, is it okay to reject my own mother, accept how things are, stop blaming her, but choose to not interact with her anymore? Sometimes it's not just okay, it's absolutely necessary. Like, you might be put in a position where you just have no choice. That's just something that you have to do in order to live your life as a sane, healthy adult, which you are allowed to. You have permission. You are allowed to do that. It's your life, it's your body, it's your brain, it's your time. You won't get the time back. No extensions, no refunds. Every second, every minute that passes, we're close to the end. So if you've tried to resolve the relationship sincerely, and you've made an effort over time and you've gotten nowhere, then you may have to make some hard decisions. But it's not other people's problems are not your sole responsibility. You have a mother, you have a father, a son, a brother. Okay, family ties are stronger, so you would allow more, you would show more patience, but that is not your burden. That's their burden, and if they're failing to carry it, as much as you may want to carry it for them, you actually can't. It's not possible. It doesn't work. And to try and carry it for them would be an example of emotional incest. Victor says, Richard, I've noticed that my mother doesn't seem to be growing up intellectually or emotionally, but she blames it on menopause. Should I self-differentiate or engage in an important combo? I really don't know, because I don't know you and I don't know your mother. You do. You may have already tried to engage her in sincere communication before and had it go nowhere. I'm sure you have. So I would just ask you, what makes you think it would be any different this time? As I said, it's not your job to fix other people's problems, even if it's your mum. All that you'll do is end up exhausting yourself, getting nowhere, and there's no medals issued for that. Nobody's going to give you a pat on the back and a box of chocolates for it. So I'd just say, I veer towards saying, don't waste your time. You're an adult, she's an adult. Barring some very, very, very cosmetic differences at the most superficial levels, I'm not particularly convinced that anybody's burden in life is particularly larger or greater than anybody else's. So I don't think you've got it easier than she had. So why should you help her? Some people don't like that idea. But I've travelled a lot, seen a lot of the world, seen how people live, seen the decisions they make, seen the decisions they don't make. I've not seen much evidence that beyond some fairly superficial cosmetic differences, anybody's burden is particularly greater or lesser than anybody else's. Pisses people off when I say that. They're like, well, what about people who are royalty and born into wealth? And I'm like, yeah, because in your fantasy, they have a great life and everything's wonderful for them. Unless you know people who were raised in that environment, and actually you'll find, wasn't that great? Wasn't that great? Wasn't that fantastic for them? Anyway, let's not get on social justice tonight. Okay, Janae asks, they try to make their problems yours, and it's very frustrating. Yeah, they love to do that. They love to put their own burdens onto you. It's their favourite thing, because they don't respect your boundaries and they don't respect you as a separate entity. They have made you a part of them, so you're a limb as far as they're concerned, and they think they have the right to do that. Anytime somebody tries to make their problems your problems, anytime, it's a really good discipline to have, is just to send it back and just say, no, you're capable of doing that. You're a grown up. You must do that. That's not my burden to carry. It seems to be yours. It's very healthy to do that. It's very sanity saving for you, and it'll do them a lot more good as well. You went on to ask another question, but unfortunately, there we go, you're back. How to get out of the trauma bond. This live is very validating. Enmeshment is a huge problem. I have a course called Break the Trauma Bond. It's a good one. I like that course. And it says the solution is something that, as far as I'm aware, is unique. I don't think anybody else is offering that as a solution. The course basically says that there actually isn't anything called a trauma bond, which is counterintuitive. I think I'm partly to blame for the popularization of using the term trauma bonding. It goes back to my old channel. It goes back to Street Fight Secrets, and it was when, I think it was like 2008, 2009. It's a long time ago, when Rihanna got back with Chris Brown after, he had punched, kicked, and I think he bit her on the face or something. And there was this conversation taking place on CNN or Fox News or something. And the woman who was the head of a major charity in America for women in domestic violent situations was asked, why do women get back with abusive men? And she couldn't answer it. So I tried to look for an answer, and I took it from cult psychology, the psychology of cults. The psychology of cults and getting people out of cults, and came across the concept of trauma bonding, released a few videos about it. It got very, very popular. And then it seemed to be after that more people were talking about trauma bonding. Years later, when people were saying to me, how do we break this? I was like, well, actually, we shouldn't call it trauma bonding. We shouldn't say that the problem is that the trauma that occurred in the past has created a bind, a shackle between you and that person, or you and that event. It's not a very helpful way for you to think about it. Because what do you do if you're shackled? If you're shackled, iron is stronger than flesh. Like, you can't break a shackle. And I don't think we're actually bound in time. I don't really subscribe fully to that idea. I think that it's part of the story, but it's not the full story. And actually, if you get out of the time bind, because psychiatry, particularly the psychology that was spawned by Daddy Freud, and we are all his grandchildren, even people who say they hate Freud are still his children, intellectually speaking. You can't escape him. Like, you just can't get away from it. There is that time bind effect. Well, you can't change the past, so therefore you're screwed. And actually, it's not true. It's not how it works. It's not how humans work. It's a very modern, mechanistic, materialistic way of looking at things. And it's actually not it's not even true. It's not even true. It's like a mistruth that we feed into. So what do? You have to accept all of that first. How do you get rid of the trauma bond? You start saying, well, there actually isn't really a trauma bond. What there is a split. There's a trauma split, if you like. And what I am, as the individual who says, I am trauma bonded to my ex, or I'm trauma bonded to this experience, actually what you're trying to do is hold on to two stories at the same time, or two versions of reality at the same time, or two versions of the person that you're talking about at the same time. And you have two hard drives, to use modern metaphors, holding two different versions of events and two different versions of that human being, and they're running at the same time, which of course is crazy making, and will give you a lot of cognitive dissonance. Can I just footnote this at this point? I've noticed, like, cognitive dissonance has become a really popular thing for people to spout off about. Cognitive dissonance is a feeling of stress. When you're holding two thoughts in your mind at the same time that contradict each other, it's the stress of holding contradictory thoughts. It's not anything else. The way people talk about it, I'm like, that's you. I know it sounds like one thing. This is psychology. They're not great at labeling stuff. They tend to mislabel, or they don't label things particularly usefully. I know it sounds like something else, but that's all cognitive dissonance is. So in the case of the so-called trauma bond, it's a massive amount of actual, real cognitive dissonance. And it becomes very, very stressful, and you'll start to break down. So what we need to do is we need to integrate the two hard drives. We need to integrate the split. So where there was that split in the skull, we now need it to reknit and become whole, so that there's just one reality. So for example, you're in an abusive romantic relationship as an adult. The person you saw your ex-husband, your ex-wife being at their worst regularly is them. It's not that they were possessed for the night, or they're only like that if they drink whiskey, or they're only like that, 3 times a year with a trip. That's them. That's who they are. And for a lot of us, this is very, very difficult to accept, because we are in a love deficient environment, and we're clinging to like one person, and we're clinging to that dream, we're clinging to that idea of love, and we're clinging to hope. This is where, Sam Vaknin released a few videos talking about the danger of hope, and how useful it is to let go of it, because hope keeps you stuck, trauma bonded, to a false reality, but it's not really trauma bonding. Hope is a great way of holding two versions of reality inside of your head. And this is, like, if you want to broaden it out from the microcosmic to the macrocosmic level, this is where we're up to in culture, broad scale. We're holding two different but completely contradictory versions of reality in our collective heads. That's why people are splitting into two camps so vociferously on a multitude of issues: masks, COVID, Brexit, Trump, I don't know, you name it, and they'll split to the extremes of two camps. Not 3, not 4, not 5, 2, just 2. This is the classic behavior for people who are deeply, deeply traumatized. If we saw that in an individual, you'd say, oh, you're creating false dichotomies, you're splitting, you're engaging in black and white thinking, you're engaging in catastrophic thinking, you're not thinking with clarity, you're not thinking you're not doing critical thinking, you're not thinking with reason, you're thinking from subjectivity, from solipsism, from emotion. So yes, breaking the trauma bond is about integrating that split. There isn't two versions of reality, there can't be. Zizek talks frequently, and it's a very useful concept, I think, about the fetishist split, which is a concept that he developed from Freud, which is where you know very well that something is not true, but with all your heart and all your might, you act as though it is. You know very well it is not true, and yet you act as though it is. The fetishist split. The fetishist split is a Zizek term for a developed Freudian concept. Isn't this the case? Isn't this where we're all living now? Culturally, as humans, as a species right now, we're all living within the chasm of cognitive dissonance of being dangled and pulled apart inside the fetishist split. Because fetish in this context is nothing sexual. A fetish is an object that's been imbued with magical properties that it doesn't actually have. And that's what we've done. We're thinking magically now. We're back in the Dark Ages. We're imbuing people and objects and things with magical properties that they just don't have. I'll answer another question now, as I promised I would. Chloe asks, why does it feel like there is so much passive aggression and straight up violence lingering in every corner, like people are waiting to burst? Because of the fetishist split, because of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a feeling of stress from holding two completely contradictory thoughts, beliefs, perspectives of reality inside your head and trying to act as though they're real, trying to act as though they're true. It's enormously stressful. So yeah, people are very, very cranky, and they're basically falling out with themselves. They're hating themselves, but they're not accepting that they're falling out with themselves. They're not accepting that they're hating themselves. So they project that hatred and that falling out outwards, and they find a target for it. And then in a very infantile, facile, overly reductive and simplistic way, they'll say, my problems are because of those people there, those people there, those people there. And this is the kind of build-up you get before, you know, wars and genocides and things of that nature. It's a beautiful night here in the Caribbean. Soft, warm wind is blowing through the palm trees. Later, before bed, to help me to sleep, I will sit under the moon and listen to the waves. The moon doesn't know anything about fetishist splits. The stray cats here, they don't know anything about cognitive dissonance. Nothing. They can't do cognitive dissonance. You could try for 1,000 lifetimes to get a cat to do cognitive dissonance. It meow wouldn't work. Mindy Martin asks, what causes emotional incest? A kind of narcissism, really. Not to slap the old narcissism word on everything, but it really is in this case. It's entitlement, it's arrogance, it's envy, it's a desire to bully, to dominate, and to enforce a self-aggrandizing false image of yourself onto other people. So that, why else would a parent force a child to fulfill a role, you know, the child shouldn't be fulfilling? So narcissism, really. That doesn't mean, not every time emotional incest occurs does it mean that a full-blown NPD is present, but it is absolutely a narcissistic act to engage in emotional incest with a child and force them into a role that they cannot consent to, and would not consent to, and should not consent to, because it's completely inappropriate, and they're not qualified for it. Your 6-year-old child is not your drinking buddy at the bar. They're not your psychotherapist. They're not your lover. They're not your mate at work. There's things you shouldn't be saying to them. There's things you shouldn't be asking them to do, and it's completely inappropriate and an abuse of power to do so. Janet asks, what's a good response when someone crosses the line? You know, we talk about fetishism. So a fetish would be, it could be something that a witch doctor or a shaman uses in a ritual. It would be the bone of the ancestors, or, I don't know, the wand, or the chalice, or the magic mirror, or whatever it is, right? And it's imbued with magical properties, both in the, you know, magical sense and in the psychological sense of like magical thinking. So it's I don't want the responsibility for it, so I push it outside, and it works. It really works. I was thinking about this just yesterday. It was a bit of a dark thought, actually. Like I've said a number of times, there's only a few ways to generate change in people, and I think I said it was, real change can only be generated by trauma, psychedelics, because you need neuroplasticity for real change. So real trauma creates neuroplasticity, creates shock. Psychedelics, and I think I said repetition, something like that. And maybe somewhere else I said like a religious experience, like when people have had they really do have a full-blown religious experience. I've seen people become born-again Christians. I've seen people become born-again Muslims. You can't really be born-again in Islam, but they really turn their life around. They really, really turn their life around. And it was, according to them, it was religion. They went back to prayer. They went back to reading their holy books, and they really cleaned themselves up. from being drunk and angry and abusive to straight, and stayed on the straight and narrow. There's a guy I know for 25 years now, and he was not going anywhere when I first knew him. So there's religion, but there's also sacrifice. There's also sacrifice. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I was like, oh yeah, never thought about that. Why throughout history have we sacrificed animals? Have we sacrificed things that are good for us? Have we sacrificed humans? Why do we do that? Because it's traumatic. So there is something in ritual and in sacrifice, especially if it's awful, especially as it's something really precious, that does change your neuroplasticity, that will create real change. But it requires a fetishistic belief that it's not coming from you. Something in humans, we really reject our own agency. It's like it's too much for us. The idea of our own agency, it appalls and terrifies us. So we fight it. So, no, I have to, kill my firstborn daughter because the high priestess told me to, so that when I set sail to fight the Greeks, everything will work out okay. What the hell does killing your kid have to do with like making sure the weather's all right for when you set sail? It's fetishism. So we're constantly trying to push the responsibility outside of ourselves. So there is no great response for when somebody crosses the line that I can give you that's canned, that would be a series of words that you could have planned that you would say, where it would be like, hey buddy, watch your damn self. Yeah, and then you could practice it in front of the mirror, like Robert De Niro from Taxi Driver, and then if somebody crosses the line, you say that and everything's okay. I would see this a lot when I was teaching self-defense. They'd be like, what's the best defense against a right hook? Or like somebody tries to grab you, kick you in the balls, what's the best defense? And I'm like, well, I don't know, how tall are they? How tall are you? Where are you standing? What are you wearing? Is it Canada in the middle of a really frosty winter and everybody's covered in like winter coats and you can't, like, what's the context? I have no idea what the context is. So actual strategy for what you are going to do or say on the day probably needs to be made up in the moment. The principles of what you're doing, you can decide ahead of time. And what I would say as far as somebody crossing the line is, and you're dealing with it, the principles, before you engage with that person, number one, and if you only remember one thing, remember this: what is my objective? What is my objective? What am I doing here? Imagine self-defense again. What do I do against a right hook? Well, are you a psychiatric nurse who's looking after a 16-year-old autistic child who doesn't know what they're doing? The response would be a bit, or are you out with your wife and you're trying to put your shopping bags in the car and a group of guys comes over and is trying to rob you? Where's the right hook? You're like, no, I just want to focus on the punch. And I'm like, but okay, a punch is a punch is a punch, but your response is got to be commensurate to the context in what's going on. I presume most of us, if we were a nurse and somebody who didn't know what they were doing turned around and punched us in the head, we wouldn't smack them with 5 elbows, get them on the floor and choke them and unconscious, right? However, if somebody broke into your house in the dead of night, you might do that, So it's different. So I would just say, know what your objective is and be super clear. And just like in a fight, if you are in the moment, present and aware, and you have your objective very clearly set in your mind, your intention is very clearly set, your options of response will reduce to 2, and one of them will be the most obvious. And it's true in physical fights, and I think it's true in verbal conflict and the defense of boundaries and interpersonal psychological and emotional spaces. It's not that complicated, but you must know what your objective is. What am I trying to do here? Am I trying to keep the peace? Am I trying to get my point across? Am I trying to make sure that somebody's not trying to rob from me? Is it my first day in prison and somebody's trying to steal my bunk? What's the objective? What's the objective would be critical. Okay, guys, I'll take another couple of questions and then I'll wrap it up. Christ Learners says, get unhooked. Yes, let's not worry about the hook. Let's worry about getting unhooked. Raisa. Oh, relax. Richard, do you believe recovery from codependency, CPTSD, wait, hang on, is a lifelong process, or can you fully heal? Thank you. I think you can fully heal, but I don't know whether you can ever realistically make up for not having had the kind of childhood that you would have been better off having, shall we say. Maybe one day we'll have new technology, new options for helping people to overcome childhood trauma, but you know, it's notoriously difficult and laborious. And I've never set myself up with the perfectionism of demanding full-scale healing. I would always be like, well, where was I and how am I doing now? Is it better? How much better is it? Well, it's like 70% better. And I'm like, damn, if you earned 70% more money by this time next year, you should and probably would be pretty grateful. So that's a result. That's a good result. If you set up a standard of going, I want to be completely trauma-free, show me the human that's completely trauma-free. I know that like this is quite unpopular now to sort of to talk about trauma and to say that everybody's traumatized. You know, you get called a snowflake if you suggest that, but they clearly are. That's why they act so crazy, because they're in pain. Like, people are in pain. We are in pain. Humanity is in pain because it hurts to be a human being. It hurts. Somebody was asking me about, I don't know, something that had happened to me, and somebody was saying something about me, and you know, one of my mates was like, how do you deal with that? And I'm like, well, nowadays my perspective is it's hard to be a person. It's hard to be a human being. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. I don't think anybody gets a free ride. I don't think, like I said before, cosmetically and at first blush, for some people it's clearly easier, or they're born into a certain degree of privilege and a certain degree of wealth, but it's no guarantee of happiness, quite the opposite. And if you have any doubts, I don't know, maybe try setting up as a life coach sometime, and you would speak to a few multi-millionaires and a few celebrities and you'd be thinking, wow, they are in as much pain as everybody else. The big house didn't help, the fame didn't help, the money didn't help. Well, that's the funny thing, isn't it? And there's psychology studies out there, numerous ones, that back this up. Beyond a certain point, more and more money, more and more agency actually doesn't make you more and more happy. Living in degradation definitely makes you more miserable. So once you get to a certain point of wealth, you're not going to get happier and happier and happier. It's just, you know, you're doing it for the sake of it. So the humility comes from saying, well, the person who's doing that and saying that, yes, it's wrong, morally, philosophically, but they're doing it because they're in pain, and they're in pain. Maybe something bad happened in childhood, maybe somebody did something to them that wasn't so nice, but they did it because they're traumatized. And if somebody did something to them in their childhood, they probably did it to them because they were traumatized. And if they were doing that to their own child and they were traumatized, the people that traumatized them were probably also traumatized. So, I don't know. That's my worldview. I'm not asking anybody to subscribe to it, but I just see the world, and maybe I took too much acid in my teens. I just took too much LSD and kept having visions of humanity tumbling down my bedroom wall in multicolored hieroglyphics. That was just intergenerational trauma, and it was tumbling. Father, son, mother, daughter, father, son, mother, daughter, father. If you've ever taken acid, it's extremely repetitive and quite distressing. And it would just go on and on and on. And I'd be like, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of language? Is there a God? What are humans for? And I'd get answers like that. It's just intergenerational trauma, on and on and on and on and on. If you come at it from that perspective, you're like, here's a person who's in pain. I don't know, do they deserve to be stoned in the town square because they hurt? If somebody chooses me as an avatar or a target for their pain, for their frustration, okay, yes, as I said, it's wrong, you shouldn't do that, it's not fair, it's not kind, it's not compassionate, absolutely, but can you see why somebody would do it? Yeah. Do you think that they're doing that because they're a really happy person who's fulfilled, who knows who they are and knows what their life is about and has good prospects? No. Only a miserable person would act that way. So only somebody who's in a lot of pain would behave in that way. Hunter says, isn't CPTSD the cause of all borderline and narcissistic behavior? Depends on who you believe. I'm in the Pete Walker, Sam Vaknin camp on this one, and I do think it is a post-traumatic stress response. I think it's largely learned. The jury's still out with the psychopathy part of the cluster B spectrum. You know, there may be more. I may have to concede that there are more genetic factors to that, but yes, it's largely CPTSD. It's largely trauma based. It's an effort to survive in very, very psychologically harsh and emotionally difficult environments as a child. They're maladaptive responses. They're maladaptive coping strategies. They're infantile coping strategies that cost everyone around the borderline and the narcissist, and they cost the borderline and the narcissist themselves, and the psychopath, and the histrionic. But you said, I thought CPTSD was impossible to, I don't know what you said, I lost the comment, it flew away, I'm sorry, I'm not in full control here. Isn't it impossible to deal with? No, not at all, not at all. Both PTSD and CPTSD can be helped massively, and there are multiple modalities for doing that. In theory, therefore, the narcissist, well, we know borderlines, people with borderline personality disorder can get help and have been helped. And the narcissist should as well be able to, in theory, if they are open to the therapeutic process, because it is a consent-based process. It's largely two adults in a room talking to each other. And if you refuse to consent to that, or you won't work with the other adult who's trying to help you, then it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to work. The day we have the technology where we can just sedate somebody and, I don't know, make them experience some sort of trauma healing simulation, like an extended dream, which I do think we'll be able to do one day. Until then, it's really just two adults in a room having a chat. When it becomes a process that you can do completely passively, then I would be much more hopeful for the narcissist and the borderline. But for everybody else with CPTSD, my God, no, you can definitely help. As far as I know of, well, based on emails, I think I've helped hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, using a lot of concepts that I took from Pete Walker's work, and some ideas from Van der Kolk and Gabor Mate as well, and various sources. So I've helped people with CPTSD. I've helped my own CPTSD, for sure. So I'm very hopeful with that. Do you guys see the Netflix TV show called Maniac? It's worth a look. It's very odd. The first episode drags a little bit, but when it gets going, it's really good, and it goes deep into this idea of having technology that helps people overcome trauma, sort of passively, by causing them to experience extremely vivid simulations of their lives, by reliving traumas, reliving and rewriting certain stories, and reliving a sense of self. They actually can overcome their trauma. It's worth a watch, guys. Maniac. I don't know if it did particularly well, but some really good ideas in it. Ibrahim says, what are the best 2 to 3 ways to overcome trauma and emotional incest? Well, I'll tell you, Ibrahim. I have a free course over on a YouTube channel called Fortress Mental Health Protection System. It's completely free. You go over there, you follow along with the tutorials. I think there's 8 or 9 of them now, and that's all for free. It'll tell you exactly what to do step by step, the sequence to do it in, and it's delivered at a level that I would have delivered to a group of 16-year-olds when I used to work in the school. So it's functional and it's accessible. The other option for overcoming emotional incest is I have a course out called Summoning the Self. That's available from SpartanLifeCoach.com, and that is to help you redevelop your boundaries and to overcome this kind of abusive relationship. So there you go. That's it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I hope that was useful. If you did like it, please hit the like button, subscribe, comment something useful, witty, charming, recommendations for movies, books, or series that you've watched. Would be most welcome. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Cheers.